It was lit up. Yes, anyway, we'll be hearing from the Department of Housing and Community Development for the newbies, that's DHCD, for some of you at least. We'll be hearing from Scott Gottbrecht with the United Way of Central Maryland. They've been very deeply involved in a lot of the programs, very successfully so. And we'll also be hearing from the Maryland Association of Counties and the MML. So MACO and MML will be testifying as well. So I have, starting off here, I'm going to start with Owen McAvoy, and we can do this in whatever order you guys would like, and let's just begin there. Okay, so hold on just 1 second. There we go.
Mr. Chairman, Owen McAvoy, Deputy Secretary at DHCD in an acting capacity. I have with me here today our Assistant Secretary, Carol Gilbert, our Deputy Director of Federal Resources, Stuart Campbell, and Daniel Meister, our Director of Community Services. We have a pretty in-depth presentation regarding the state's rental assistance program, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to turn it over to Danielle to get started.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So first, we'll just walk through a few basics on the background of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. We know there's several new members of the committee since we came last year and talked about ERAP. Just a quick reminder that there's actually 2 tranches of emergency rental assistance funding that we and our local county partners have been administering across the state over the last 2 years. The first tranche of funding was awarded by Congress back in January 2021 through the Consolidated Appropriations Act. That was about $403 million total. $258 million of that funding comes to the state at DHCD, and we then pass the majority of those funds through to county programs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. $145 million of that went directly to the largest 8 counties in Maryland. Congress and Treasury developed a funding formula that allocated funds to both states and local county jurisdictions based on population. There was a second tranche of funding that came out in May 2021, so about 4 months later. The total for that was $352 million for statewide allocations, $204 million of which was again awarded to DHCD at the state level, and $148 million was awarded again directly to those 8 counties in Maryland. And so you'll hear me talk about direct grantees, or often the big 8, because it's the largest 8 jurisdictions. So this is a map of who received direct federal allocations from Treasury. As you can see, it's most of the Central Maryland region as well as the Capital region. We have the most populous jurisdictions represented there. While some of those are more rural, they received funding from Treasury if they had at least 200,000 residents in their county. So back in 2021, when we were initially looking at what was the best way to implement this program and deploy this unprecedented amount of rental assistance funding, we wanted to make sure that we at DHCD gathered a lot of input, that we were gathering best practices from our local community partners. So we went through a series of consultations. The first group that we worked closely with was actually members of the General Assembly. So we had an ERAP advisory work group that was bipartisan. It met several times in February 2021 all the way until September 2021. So we had 3 meetings kind of pre-launch of the program in the design phase. Then we had 3 follow-up meetings to share progress, lessons learned, things that were working well, and things that were challenging. They advised us on program strategy. They gave input into the funding formula that we eventually developed, as well as how local counties could be most effectively utilized in this process. We also did county level consultations. So we met one-on-one with every county in the state. We also had group roundtables. We did those both before the design of the program, and we've continued monthly roundtables with every county in the state since the inception of the program, our next set of which is tomorrow. And we also consulted with legal services providers, our continuums of care across the state, which normally are the entities that do homeless prevention or rental assistance. as well as community action agencies, as they really are the frontline providers that are getting the most requests for assistance. And then, of course, we also consulted with our partner sister agencies in the state, Human Services, Labor, Disabilities, and our Interagency Council on Homelessness, which DHCD staffs. So a little bit about kind of our approach to how we would allocate our funds. You know, a portion of these funds from the federal government were going directly to counties. They didn't touch the state. We had no influence on how those were allocated or where they went. So we had to be really strategic with how we would allocate and deploy our portion of the funds. So if you remember, there's 8 counties that got direct federal funding. Those 8 counties actually represent about 80% of renter households in the state. So we have a really high density of renters in those 8 counties. The main problem we saw right away is that only 39% of the federal funds were going to those counties. So there was automatically a disparity in where funds were being allocated proportionate to where renter households actually reside. The other issue we found too is that the federal funding formula only allocated funds based on population. It did not allocate funds based on renter households. It certainly did not allocate funds based on low-income renter households, which was the target population. So households who are under 80% of the area median income is the eligible population for these funds. So as we looked at how to best deploy our funding, we felt the need that we had to right size. So the amount of funding going to every jurisdiction really did not reflect the level of need. So we created a funding formula which was based on the county's share of renter households statewide. We also looked at data from the Urban Institute's Rental Assistance Prioritization Tool, where it compares census tracts across the state compared to each other. And it looks more at like socioeconomic factors, issues of equity, disproportionate risk factors for eviction, and it assigns a score essentially to each census tract for how at risk are the residents in that particular community. And then we also took into account how much funding had already been allocated to that jurisdiction from Treasury and essentially worked backwards from a needs-based formula. So the supplemental state funds, we also, the largest portion of our funds were awarded based on formula. We also did some supplemental funding based on application pipelines once the program actually started. So we have awarded funds in multiple rounds to our local partners to both have kind of a baseline allocation and then also adjust in real time as we started to get applications in, as we started to see what the demand for rental assistance was. These were some of the guiding principles that we followed as we allocated funds. We were striving to be equitable, low barrier, and locally driven. We really wanted folks to not just get access to rental assistance, we wanted them to get access to all the other things that they were struggling with during COVID. Things like utility assistance, help with accessing food resources, help with getting connected to public benefits. And so as we started designing this program, we wanted to have it be locally driven because those local partners we already work with can provide those kinds of supports. There are other states who administered a more centralized program and they just had an application portal people applied to, but it was a standalone resource. It was not wrapped into housing stability services. It wasn't wrapped into connecting people to these other resources that might exist out in the community. So that is something that is fundamentally different about Maryland's program. We also strove to be low barrier, so wherever possible, we have tried to reduce documentation requirements, eligibility requirements. Folks who are in crisis, especially during COVID-19, didn't always have access to all the documentation. Normally they might be provided or might be required to provide pre-pandemic. So things in the old days that might have been required under other federal programs like an ID or a birth certificate, those are things that are not required under ERAP. We have followed the Treasury guidance to be as low barrier as possible in implementing this program. So where are we now? We're about a year and a half in. We launched this program in May 2021, officially across the state. We are at the point where we're at the tail end of the funding. So the projections that we have based on our historical spending and based on where county programs are now indicates that 100% of programs are going to have fully exhausted their allocations by March or April. Some counties have already closed their application portals, so there's some data in the slides about that. About 14 have already closed to new applications. another 3 counties are still accepting applications, but on a very limited basis, mostly folks who already have an eviction notice. And then another 7 county programs, which are mostly rural jurisdictions, they're continuing to accept applications, but will probably close their portals by March. So we are looking at a fiscal situation where the current rounds of funding is going to end sometime in March or April. We do have a couple larger programs that will have some limited funding to continue through June on the housing services side. So they'll have exhausted financial assistance, but they still have funding to support things like legal services or case management. So some of those kinds of services will continue through June 2023 in some of the larger jurisdictions. But for the most part, financial assistance is what we're talking about being exhausted in a couple months. We have about $5.4 million left in our ERAP funding that is unallocated, which sounds like a lot, but for a program that spends $30 million statewide in a given month, it's essentially a week of operations if we were to get it all out on the allocations table now. So we are going to be strategically allocating that to the largest jurisdictions to help with some transition support, but that $5 million will not go very far. So this is a table showing the ERAP allocations that came into the state. As you can see, the red columns are ERAP 1 funding. It includes both the state ERAP portion as well as the direct federal grants to those big 8 counties. The yellow is ERAP 2, and then the black is the combination of ERAP 1 and 2. So the vast majority of funds, $662 million approximately, went to local county programs to provide general rent relief to their residents. About $51 million was administered through our own program in-house at DHCD, the Assisted Housing Relief Program, where we did bulk rent relief for tenants that are in affordable housing developments. We also use a small portion on admin. We also funded access to counsel and evictions. I'm sure most folks are aware of that initiative within the state. So we provided about $5.4 million under ERAP 2 towards that initiative. And then we have $25.5 million currently allocated for development of affordable housing. So this is a chart showing the general geographic distribution of program funds. This is based on the original allocations. We've since had to make some modest adjustments as we're closing out ERAP 1. That's currently underway right now. So some jurisdictions are moving funds between ERAP 2, ERAP 1, and we're also reallocating based on actual spending. But for the most part, these allocations are still the majority of what happened. And generally, if you look at those percentages for total ERAP funds, they align pretty closely with a jurisdiction's share of the state's rental households. These are some of the milestones that we have marked off on the last couple of years. You may have heard this. One of the challenges since the inception of this program has been the lack or constantly changing guidance from Treasury about how to administer ERAP. We also have had the fortune of having several surprise deadlines for spending along the way. So we've laid all of these out in this table. For ERAP 1, the main deadline is we have to exhaust 100% of funds by September 2022. So by congressional bill language, that is required. ERAP 2 is a little bit different. The statute actually allows spending through 2025, but Treasury set more aggressive milestones. And so essentially, to keep your funding for ERAP 2, you had to expend 20% of those funds by March, 40% by June, and 60% by September. So you can see there's a real federal charge to spend the funds quickly, get them out the door quickly. And that's part of the reason we are where we are now, where most of the funds in the state have been exhausted. This is a snapshot of who's been assisted since the inception of the program. So this is on the left for total households assisted and total people assisted. This is statewide data. This includes both people assisted through state dollars as well as those local direct grants to counties from Treasury. Statewide, we've served over 101,000 households, which, considering the average household size for ERAP is about 2.4 to 2.5 people, means that we've assisted over 242,000 Marylanders since the program began. Over on the right, there's some data about the kinds of households that we're serving. This data reflects just the state-funded portion of the program. So we collect a lot more robust data on the grants that we administer. Of those, we see about 29% are headed by a male, 71% are headed by a female. When it comes to race, about 74% of households are headed by a Black or African American adult, 21% are headed by a white head of household, 3% are multiracial or mixed race, and then we have several other smaller populations in there as well. Ethnicity, about 92% of households are not Hispanic or Latino, 8% are. When we look at age demographics, about 86% of households are headed by someone between 25 and 61, so not youth and young adults, not seniors. When it comes to income, we really have reached the people we intended to serve. So if you remember, the folks who are eligible for this program are 80% of area median income and below. By Treasury guidance, we're required to prioritize those that are 50% AMI and below first. So far over the lifetime of the program, 61% of the households we serve are under 30% AMI, which, and also based on our data, most of those actually have zero income. So they're even further on the lower end of that scale. And then another 25% of households are between 31 and 50% AMI. Another measure that we track is how long have adults been unemployed at the time they apply for assistance. This is also a population we're required to prioritize under ERAP. So 39% of adults in the household were unemployed for at least 90 days at the time they applied for ERAP assistance. This is a chart showing the expenditures to date on the program. This is inclusive of expenditures on state funds through the end of December and expenditures for the big 8 counties direct grants through November 30th. We don't have December data for them yet. And so this table is a snapshot. So as you can see over in the right-hand column, we have the percentage of each grant or each county's allocation that has been spent. For the most part, everyone is somewhere between 80% to 100%. Some counties have fully exhausted all of their funds already. This is a summary. There's a little bit of a formatting issue here, but a summary. So of the $755 million that initially came from Treasury into the state, we had about $729 million that specifically went towards rental assistance. Of that, we have about $136 million left, and that's the amount that we expect to be spent between December and April 2023. This is a snapshot of court data on evictions. So I know this might be a little bit difficult to see, but in the leftmost yellow area, that is actually 2019 averages. So pre-pandemic, before COVID-19 came about, in an average month, you would have about 1,748, so 1,748 evictions. Over the course of COVID-19, there's been eviction moratoriums, there's been rental assistance available, court dockets had been backed up because of COVID. And so that really suppressed eviction filings and eviction data for the last couple of years. What we've seen since March and April is a quick uptick in those numbers. So we are very quickly seeing eviction numbers approach pre-pandemic levels. If you look at September 2022 data, which is the month that we have most recently from the courts, it's about 1,447 evictions. So we're almost back at that level of 1,748. And by now, considering a few months have passed, those actually might have risen above 2019 pre-pandemic levels by now. So the data on rental assistance needs is actually really difficult to capture. There's not a national data set on who needs rental assistance. It's a largely unregulated industry. And so there are some data points that we can use to help guide our efforts and indicate maybe how much more help is needed. There are U.S. Census household pulse surveys taken every 2 weeks with Americans, where they ask about whether folks are behind on their rent. They ask them if they've applied for rental assistance. And the National Equity Atlas puts some estimates together every 2 weeks on that data. So according to their estimates in Maryland, as of December, there's still an estimated 373 million of total rent debt that's out there. There's about 108,000 households behind on rent, and they estimate about 102,000 children are part of those households. I would argue that's actually a higher number, most likely, based on the trends we see with rental assistance. And the majority of households have actually not applied. So based on those census surveys, 64% of households report that they have not applied for assistance yet. That might be because they weren't eligible, maybe they're over the income limit, or it could be they just didn't know how to access their local program. So the data that we're seeing still indicates a large need for ongoing rental assistance, even as these federal funds are close to being exhausted. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly to the committee, I'm going to go through all the witnesses on this panel and then we'll entertain questions. So who would you like to have speak next? Or is that your entire presentation?
This is the whole thing.
That's the whole thing. Okay, questions. All right, first question goes to Delegate Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. This ERAP money has been a real shot in the arm to a lot of people. Some of the conversations that I've been having with people kind of go focus around one of the last statements that you made in reference to some of the households, renters, tenants, not applying for ERAP money. Is there a process whereby the landlord can apply on behalf of the tenant as number one? And a follow-up to that is, explain to us the process, if there is one, where the landlord can receive the funds as opposed to the tenant receiving the funds for the rent.
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially, when we launched the program, we required every county to accept applications from both landlords and tenants. Some even went beyond that and set up opportunities for bulk rent applications where a landlord could submit one application on behalf of multiple tenants in their property. We have had pretty good success with that. A lot of landlords are engaged. One challenge is that the federal government requires tenants to consent to the application process and the delivery of assistance. So while a landlord can apply on behalf of a tenant, the tenant still has to sign the application. They still have to give permission to the rental assistance program to provide assistance on their behalf. So certainly there have been, some cases where a tenant may not be willing to cooperate with their landlord and apply for that.
And the second part of that was funding going directly to the landlords.
Yeah, in general, something like 98% of payments go directly to the landlord from the program. So most of the time, the only time we do a direct-to-tenant payment is if the landlord is refusing a payment.
Now, if I may, Mr. Chair, sometimes, I'm asking this question, a landlord not be willing to accept a payment is based upon what, in your opinion?
Yeah, it could be many reasons. I think the most common one that we see is, someone didn't pay rent for so long and the landlord just wants them out of the unit, right? There's no amount of rent that they could pay to convince the landlord to stay in that unit. Sometimes there's other issues going on. It might not be the tenants just behind on rent. It could be that they have disturbances going on. Maybe they have breach of lease situations also going on. So there's some landlords who, for them, they're not willing to accept that payment. What I will say, though, is, there was legislation passed in the last session that requires a landlord to accept a payment from ERAP. That has helped cut down on that problem. So, but I think what we find more often is there are just some situations where landlords are ready to move on. They don't want to continue to rent to the same tenant. And then what we have seen more recently in the last year is a lot of landlords want to be able to turn that unit over to be able to get more rent for the unit, right? So they want to be able to charge more And the only way they can do that is by breaking the current lease.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for the presentation, and I echo Delegate Holmes's statements about the importance of ERAP. I just want to go back a little bit to the data that you talked about. It says, and I may have just missed what you said about this, in terms of 108,000 households behind on rent. Where that data comes from, where does that come from?
Yeah, so the U.S. Census actually conducts a survey every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks, okay.
Yeah, it's called the Household Pulse Survey. It started after COVID-19 to collect specific COVID-19 data, and the National Equity Atlas takes that survey data and then extrapolates it, does estimates for statewide and national figures.
And so have you looked at how that compares to the need? So that is from, if I'm trying to read the really small print, but November 9th through the 19th.
December.
Of 20, sorry, I meant December of 2022. Do you know how that compares to what the trend of that looks like?
Yeah, so I think the chart to look at is the one right below the 373.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yep, so it definitely has fluctuated over time. We saw, the largest, the highest levels of folks behind on rent in the early parts of the pandemic in, April and May 2021. As folks got caught up on their rent balances, that number has started to go down. So at one point it got as low as 10%, and that's around the time of eviction moratoriums, getting ready to end. It's around the time that rental assistance was really getting ramped up a lot across both the state and national levels. And then since has started to uptick a little bit as we're kind of returning to normal. The lighter line is the United States as a whole, and the dark blue line is Maryland. So as of right now, the data is estimating that about 13% of our renter households in Maryland are still behind on their rent.
Okay. So do you have, one of the things I'm very interested in working on is how do we collect data on this? And also, I guess, just throwing this out there also, like what are the plans to, I guess, not replace these funds, but to considering the need is still so high, what are those plans going forward, and what more can we be doing to collect the data, including how many people are being turned away from rental assistance? Because one of the things this doesn't reflect, although maybe it's somewhere in data, is the people who just left because they couldn't figure it out.
Right. So I can start with the data that we have. So the data we do have is folks who have applied for assistance and when application portals were open. So I'll use Prince George's County as an example because they had such a large volume of applications when the program launched. They closed their application portal fairly early in December 2021. So the data we don't have is who would have applied for assistance but could not because a portal had already closed. So programs have been closing portals as funding is available to them. So lack of data on the need for rental assistance is an ongoing challenge. And so the data we use mostly to look at trends is the data we have on the applications that are being accepted. The challenge that we'll start to encounter is, within the next few months, everyone will have shut down their application portals. We won't have data anymore on the need for rental assistance. There's a few strategies counties have been implementing to continue the life of their program. So some have been using other state funds that were already allocated by DHCD or other agencies for rental assistance. Some have been using their local recovery funds through the American Rescue Plan Act to help out with this. But those funds are relatively small, and they will only give them maybe another month or two of operations. It won't extend them into, say, fiscal year 24. And then, there's, I think, a question of whether a permanent rental assistance program is needed and could be funded, but we would defer to, the governor and the General Assembly on whether that's the right approach.
Thank you.
I was I was wondering, thank you. I was wondering with that March, April deadline you talked about where the counties are going to be closing down these rental assistance programs, is that based on a federal or a state deadline, or is that when you project that the money will all be spent, or both?
It's when we're projecting the money will be fully spent out. So some folks, they may continue to process existing applications, but we will have fully obligated all the funds to households by March or April.
Okay. Okay, so last year, I think there was a presentation, I'm not sure who up here was part of that, to the Joint Select Committee on Homelessness, and there was a concern about whether at some point in time, if monies were not spent, that there would be a clawback, that the feds would take back unspent money. Is that still a concern?
No,
No.
we have, luckily.
Yeah.
So there's that chart in here with all those deadlines. So we're happy to report the state met all of them. So we had to work really closely with our local county partners and very strategically spend, which allocation is going to come first. Because some of our big 8 counties are essentially administering 4 different pots of funding. Their own 2 directly from Treasury and their 2 from us. So being able to meet these targets meant a lot of state, local collaboration to make that work. But for every jurisdiction, for the most part, has met all of those. We actually have had a net increase in federal funding, so we've had $2 million more come into the state, and no one has had any loss of funds outside the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then the second question is about, I believe it was your second slide that talked about monitoring disparities and being able, when you identified disparities with assistance, you were able, the state, or maybe you meant the state, the county level, the slide said you were able to pivot quickly. What do you mean by that? What did that look like?
Yeah, so I'd say our plan was to monitor and need to pivot quickly. And what we were really happy to find out is that we didn't need to for the most part. So, initially when you launch a program of this size, you worry that assistance won't get to the right people who really need it, right? Without this help, maybe become homeless, or maybe the assistance only reaches certain types of groups. What the data has shown us is that we've reached the households who are the most statistically impacted by eviction in historical ways, often households that are headed by a single female and households of color. For years, there's been national data that shows those 2 groups are the most impacted by eviction, and that's where most of our assistance is going. So we've been really pleasantly excited that, the assistance is getting to the households who appear to need it the most. We also did a really robust marketing and outreach campaign for the first year of the program, where we worked with community-based organizations to get the word out to specific groups that were culturally competent messages. We worked with, Spanish language translation. We did public radio ads, call center. We had a range of kind of affirmative outreach strategies that I think really helped that. And our local partners also did targeted mailings, in addition to us, to households in certain census tracts that we knew aligned with the residents who are most likely to be at risk of eviction.
Great.
So.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate it. I heard in your presentation that you collect data for those that were unemployed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering, I looked through your slides. Do you have data by chance on those, the median household income by chance for those that applied?
Sure, yeah. Let me go forward. Yeah, so right there on the right-hand side where you see income, this is the breakdown. Now, this is just state data. This doesn't include the Big 8's direct grants with Treasury. But for all the funds we've administered, this is the breakdown by income level. So 25% have been 31 to 50% AMI, 61% have been under 30% AMI. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but a large portion of that 0 to 30% are actually zero income, so no income to work with.
Okay, thank you so much.
Goes to Delegate Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this. It's very enlightening to see how this program works. My question is about whether or this is the only program that's available in the state for people that are in these kind of situations, or if there are other things that are going. I just noticed, for example, that the city of Hyattsville has an emergency relief program that's open till May 31st. Is that using this money? Is it a different source of money or what?
Different source. So if there's ever a city or a township administering their own rental assistance, they're usually doing that with American Rescue Plan Act funds, the state and local recovery funds. Many of them launched kind of a supplemental rental assistance program when their local county might have either run out, or maybe they just wanted to also do rental assistance, but those are not ERAP funds. So most of the programming available in the state for rental assistance right now is available through ERAP. There are some small amounts of funding available through local social service departments that have always been part of the state budget, as well as our local continuums of care who we work with do some homeless prevention as well for the folks who are 0 to 30% AMI and also have no support network. So without help, they'll lose their housing in 21 days. But those programs are much smaller in scale than what ERAP has been providing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to keep this one brief. First of all, do we have your name and contact information? Just if you could send that to us, or I'm just not sure we have that, because maybe I could follow up with you offline. But the one other question that I did want to mention is my concern about something you mentioned, which was the need to be late on your rent in order to take advantage of these funds. And I think what I found out, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that's not a requirement of this funding source, but it's just sort of how they're being triaged at this point. Is that?
Yeah, so for the most programs that still have an application available, they're accepting applications from everyone who's eligible. Most programs have completely shut down their application portal. And then there's this middle group where they have a really small amount of funding left. And so essentially what they're doing is working directly with the courts and the sheriff's offices for people who are right at the point of eviction to do last minute help to keep them in their housing. So there's 3 bigger county programs that are doing that. And they're doing that because they have so few funds left. They want to be kind of last ditch funding, as we call it.
Okay, I appreciate that. And did I understand you to say that I think this is what you were just saying, is that there's not other sources of state funding for this? Generally speaking, people being unable to pay their rent.
Right. What I would say is the existing sources we have are fully utilized in a pre-pandemic year, right?
Okay.
So they're used very quickly. Funds run out early in the fiscal year,
Okay.
and this was pre-COVID-19 is the case. So.
And then the final question is still about that late, because obviously we need to. I think it's pretty clear that more money needs to be in this, given the need that we're seeing. But I'm still concerned about this like needing to be late, and I understand why it's triaged that way. But who then pays the late fees?
We do. Yeah.
You do. So that's
yes.
another drain on the money, is if you have to wait.
Yeah.
Which I understand is the triage.
And
needed,
sometimes landlords are willing to waive them. So we do ask landlords to waive late fees, court fees as a condition of receiving payment from the program. But for those 3 programs that are essentially doing kind of eviction notice only programs, they're so far into the court process that the landlord just, the balance needs to be taken care of, and the program can cover that. But compared to the rents that are owed, the fees are very modest. A lot of as you can see, the average household rent debt that we are servicing is about $4,000. So court fees and late fees are very small compared to that $4,000 amount.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any. Thank you very much. Very informative presentation. I'm going to, I know on our, on the agenda it was MACO and MML next, but I'd like to go to the United Way of Central Maryland next, because they were very deeply in, what? Oh, is it a problem? I can go to Mako if it's logistically. All right. So United Way of Central Maryland, we have Scott Gottbrecht and Auna Cooper. Did I? Please correct me if I okay. Forgive me. While you're setting up, I just want to let the members, the newer members of the committee know that I decided to go to them next because they were very deeply involved in distributing and managing the distribution of funds in the state of Maryland, and it was reported by many that they did a pretty good job. So there, if I, when you go out of order, complimenting people usually smooths things over. So who'd like to go first? But please tell me your name again. Anna, lovely name. Sorry I mispronounced it.
The committee. Scott and I are here to share some of what we're seeing on the ground in terms of ongoing need for rental assistance across multiple jurisdictions and to emphasize the seriousness of the situation from our vantage point as a nonprofit service provider. Before we jump into the numbers, though, we think it's important to emphasize the people who are being impacted by our programs and the decisions we make around housing. In one recent case from just a few weeks ago, a client who we'll call Jessica and her son with disabilities were facing homelessness and financial ruin due to 3 months of rental arrears. Jessica's husband died earlier in the pandemic, making Jessica the sole provider. When Jessica contracted COVID a few months ago, she missed many hours of work and soon fell behind on rent. Even though she returned to work full-time, she didn't have enough money left over at the end of the month to pay towards her unpaid rent debt. Jessica heard about United Way's STEP program and applied through her landlord. Using emergency rental assistance funding, United Way was able to pay off Jessica's back rent, utilities, and pay 3 months forward rent to give Jessica some time to get back on her feet or transition to a new unit that might be a better fit for her family's needs and budget. She's also now able to work with our case managers to stabilize and increase her income and assist with planning around her son's special needs. Jessica told us if it weren't for rental assistance, she and her son would have become homeless. It's families like this one that we should keep in mind as we make resource decisions for the year ahead. United Way of Central Maryland's perspective on rental assistance is rather unique because we have been administering a significant amount of rental assistance in 5 out of the 8 largest jurisdictions in the state. When the pandemic hit, we partnered with Baltimore County, Maryland DHCD, and the Maryland Multi-Housing Association to co-create an innovative program model, the Strategic Targeted Eviction Prevention, or STEP program, which uses data to identify the hardest hit communities and provides rental assistance in bulk by working directly with the landlords. Baltimore County won the Achievement Award for Innovation for this partnership from the National Association of Counties. The STEP program has been entrusted with administering ERA grants totaling approximately $97 million, and we have distributed approximately 80% of those funds to assist 11,000 households in the past 16 months. That's an average of about $5 million per month. We have about 20% or $18 million of our rental assistance funds remaining, and that's enough to sustain our operations for about 4 more months at the current rate. That's right on track with the state average for the percentage of funds remaining and the timeline for spend down. Now, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Scott Gottbrecht, Vice President of Housing and Senior Program Officer with United Way of Central Maryland.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you, Chairman, for the kind words. We'll take anything we can get. So we've been keeping a close eye on data over the course of the pandemic. One of the things we do is we survey recipients of our assistance frequently. We even conduct tenant focus groups to hear their perspective about how we can improve things and what their situation looks like. Our recent data from our survey in September and October shows that 74% of households who received assistance, and remember our program targets the lowest income, most vulnerable subset of households, but 74% of households are continuing to struggle with rent, with the average remaining rent debt at about 3 months. That's consistent with what we're seeing from the Census Bureau's household pulse survey data that shows for Marylanders who are behind on rent, 92% of Marylanders behind on rent owe 3 months or less. Our 211 data is also telling, and 211 data is especially useful because we can drill down to the jurisdiction or look at the precise type of need that callers are calling about. Our 211 data shows that the last 2 quarters are particularly concerning, and we're in the middle of a rental assistance demand peak. The first peak was near the end of 2020 when the eviction moratoria were coming to an end. 2021 was mostly a plateau. And in the last 2 quarters in 2022 were the highest consecutive quarters for callers calling in for rental assistance that we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic. One of the questions, obviously, that you may be asking yourself is, why does rental assistance demand continue at this point in the pandemic? I thought COVID was over with. And there are a variety of reasons for that. First and foremost, COVID is still rampant and it is still with us. You know, I myself missed 15 days of work this last year simply because of, our household getting COVID, the nanny's household getting COVID, school closures, and our preschooler needing to be home. Were I a part-time employee, those would be lost hours and missed paychecks, and that means I would be evicted if it hadn't have been for for being able to work at a really effective nonprofit. The second reason is asset depletion. Low-income families are tapped out. They're maxed out on savings, they're maxed out on credit cards, and that means that they're a very short distance away from eviction. All it takes when they have few assets is a small financial disruption, like a few days of missed work, and then they can't make ends meet that month. And so when you've got system-wide vulnerabilities with households with few buffers between themselves and homelessness, it doesn't take much to tip them into homelessness. And the third reason is what we like to call rent gluts. So if you, like in Jessica's case, if you are fully employed but you lost your income or you were behind for 3 months in a row, you can be fully employed and begin making regular rent payments again, but that 3 months of rent debt is going to follow you around and remain with you. And most extremely low income households don't have extra income at the end of the month to effectively pay down on back rents. And so it's just that's where a lot of households have parked their pandemic financial insecurity. They've chosen to keep the lights on or food on the table and been unable to make rent. And so the financial woes of the pandemic pile up in that space. Evictions are devastating for families and communities. And so I wanted to kind of bring into focus a little bit exactly what we're describing here. If the large number of outstanding households with rent debt and evictions is unable to be addressed. So evictions don't always lead to homelessness, but just the process of being evicted itself can be extremely traumatic for the children of the household. A housing displacement is considered an adverse childhood experience, and that can contribute to serious lifelong challenges for a child for the rest of their life. Similarly, anytime a household is displaced, it puts children an average of 3 or more months behind on their studies, given they have to find a new classroom, new books, new teachers, new Fen groups. I'm surprised it's only 3 months, but that's a significant driver of being held back a grade or dropping out altogether. From a system perspective, 1 in 10 evictions, that's kind of the general academically agreed upon average, 1 in 10 evictions leads to homelessness. And we've seen some projections that next year, left unchecked, this evictions crisis may result in 17,000 avoidable evictions, and that would result in close to 2,000 additional households entering the homeless services system. Most experts agree that the social costs of homelessness are extreme. Once a household becomes homeless, it's like being in quicksand. The longer you're in, the deeper you get, and the harder it is to get you out. And folks almost always can't escape homelessness without assistance. One Florida study showed that the average homeless individual costs the social service system something on the order of $30,000 a year, simply in health service costs, social system costs, shelter costs, and the like. It's very clear from our perspective that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and if we don't get a handle on this evictions crisis and take a preventative approach, we're going to be paying for the pound this next fiscal year in massive numbers of increasing homelessness. rental assistance is a crucial key in the crucial tool in the toolbox, and our recommendation is that additional monies be brought from the state into the rental assistance space. There's really no indication that additional federal money is on the way. There's a significant unmet need in the state. I think a lot of folks are concerned about the price tag of what this rental assistance takes. If you'd looked at DHCD's slide, you see that the tsunami of rent debt is coming down inch by inch. We're making a dent in this thing. We're getting the crisis under control. The amounts that are projected as needed for the state are significantly less than they had been in the peak of the pandemic years. But I think that we really need to pivot the conversation from being about if we're going to provide a strategy around rental assistance to how we're going to provide a strategy. The meat of that insight being that whatever allocation can be provided to deal with this, communities will be able to budget that, stretch those funds, triage, focus on the most vulnerable, but there needs to be some allocation for jurisdictions and providers to work with. Otherwise, they're literally just going to be turning every single person away, and households will be evicted without any opportunities for recourse. One other component of this entire equation that's worth emphasizing is that the current federal ERAP funds are able to be used for things like relocation and self-sufficiency services. It's not just a free money giveaway. The self-sufficiency supports help households regain their income, budget, financially plan, and relocate if necessary to accommodations that they can afford. That whole spectrum of tools in the toolbox needs to be activated to address this crisis. Otherwise, other goals for Maryland will be severely complicated. The rate of new people entering the homeless services system will far outpace the creation of new affordable housing units. We need a strategy that takes eviction prevention as one of the cornerstones of dealing with this point in the pandemic. I put Anna and I's contact information into the slide deck, so if anyone needs to contact us afterwards, you know how to find us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon, and more importantly, thank you for all of your work that you've done to help us administer this program. I think without y'all, I think we would have been in a world of hurt in terms of quickly getting these dollars out into the street. And that's actually what I wanted to ask about, which is that, like the chairman said, I've heard nothing but good things about the STEP program. I think if anything, y'all undersold it. So I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about it in the context of, I was disappointed that my home county did not opt in to the STEP program. And I was wondering, I suspect that that led to our inability to spend dollars as quickly, get them out quickly. I worry that maybe it even led to evictions that could have been prevented had we opted into the STEP program. And so my question is essentially, number one, am I right about that? And number two, more importantly, do you guys have any data showing, comparing either the pace of spending money or the rate of evictions in counties that did work with y'all versus the counties that did not work with y'all?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thanks for the opportunity to wax poetic about our successes. So United Way of Central Maryland is Baltimore City and the 5 surrounding counties, Anne Arundel, Hartford, Howard, Carroll, Baltimore County.
And MoCo is in the capital region, right? Is that right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so it wasn't available there, although we were more than willing to help jurisdictions replicate our model. The gist of our model is we supplement jurisdictional tenant-based programs that do the one-at-a-time kind of household approach. Much like when you're painting a room, you need a paintbrush and a roller brush. The paintbrush helps get the individual spots, the gaps, the fissures, the hard-to-reach places, but you want the roller brush to handle the large swaths. And so our program works with landlords primarily of multifamily units to bundle every delinquency in their portfolio and do a single check to pay off all those delinquencies at once. Therefore, we get an economy of scale, we save on overhead, and we become more efficient. Also, by working with the landlords, we effectively deputize the property managers as partners and get the whole landlord community rowing in the same direction to gather the paperwork, fill the gaps, and make efficient payouts. It's also great because we don't have to sit back and wait for the tenants to come to our program. We can work with the landlord to identify any household that's delinquent in their portfolio and push the program out to them before they even ask for assistance. And so we're able to access more vulnerable households in a way that many mainstream programs aren't able to. Now, we work hand in hand with jurisdictional programs. They have their tenant-facing program, and then it's called the Strategic Targeted Eviction Prevention Program because we roll out in a strategic triage way to address the kind of hotspot areas. I was looking at my lawn this morning and thought this is a great analogy. So my lawn is, is not in good shape after the winter, and the whole thing needs, the weed and feed. But there are spots where obviously more tender loving care is going to be needed, more resources are needed. So I'm gonna, when I get the time, I'm gonna spread, resources all over the yard. But there's also gonna be the places that are really, struggling, and I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna spread extra, fertilizer and seeds and resources to those areas. That's what our program does. So the jurisdictional programs, city programs are that kind of blanket the whole yard with assistance. Our program comes in and focuses on the hot spots and directs additional resources there in a bulk and organized, efficient way. We don't have any data to compare to other jurisdictions, but that's definitely food for thought. One of the general recommendations I think that folks in this space are suggesting is that we find a way to get an authorized task force or some kind of body to dig deep into the data, to do comparative analysis, look at more concretely, precisely what Maryland needs and what the best practices are that work for Maryland to create an ongoing safety net for vendors after the pandemic. This year is a little bit different because we're still in a pandemic year and we're not out of the woods yet. That's what our data is showing.
Awesome, thank you for that, and hopefully we can find some more money for y'all to help us spend. And also, if you ever give any analogy training courses, those are some really good ones. I feel like maybe some folks in the General Assembly could use your help. Thank you.
I was going to say, it's always very dangerous to come into this committee and make fertilizer analogies, because we are very concerned that you don't over-fertilize your lawn and have urban runoff into the bay. So in any case, you don't have to answer that. Next question goes to Delegate Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Funny thing, I was thinking the same thing about fertilizer, but I wanted to know, as it relates to, of course, trauma and educational delays and increases in homelessness, how, whether it was the UI debacle or job placement, also affects some of the work that you are doing and some of the kind of lingering issues around preventing further evictions.
Support services, case management.
Sure. So we provide case management services also in situations where someone may have had to relocate, you move from the unit because of it being uninhabitable or the landlord not wanting to participate in any sort of eviction prevention programs. We provided households with security deposits, rental assistance up to 6 months. We also provided them with case management services during that time, moving costs if they needed them, and then depending on their situation and funding, we also provided households with furniture because we were seeing some households that were coming to us and their unit was deemed a vacate due to it being uninhabitable due to a sewage backup or infestation. So our team would deploy and also do resource coordination for households that may need to increase their income, that may need to do benefits screening and acquire other additional resources from TCA or from the SNAP program, or maybe be connected to mental health services or other health services within the area as well. So that is the way that our team supported through case management.
You essentially did in-depth case management for each person, and it sounds like you also provided services for those who not necessarily were in like eviction crisis, but like in inhabitable household crises where they've had to go, and it's, or for whatever reason, folks live where they can live until, they can find better. So you were moving them out of hazardous situations as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And just so I'm clear, this is going to be a continued program as it relates to housing with or without the additional funding that has come, although you would like more funding.
So, no.
I just want to get a clarification.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so the bulk of our programs are funded through the federal ERAP program. And, to reference back to your previous question, those federal rules prohibit us from requiring job training, job placement, job search as a condition of receiving rental assistance. And up until now, I think as the DHCD team pointed out, the U.S. Treasury has really been pushing everybody under threat of reallocation to get the money out the door. And the focus has been just, how much have you spent, how many households have you served, and is the money being spent down? And that has left little breathing room or bandwidth to focus on the long-term housing stability services and supports. Eviction prevention prior to the pandemic was not a money giveaway. It was the hands-on case management. Let's make a plan, get you back to self-sufficiency, address the immediate crisis, yes, but how do we set you up for long-term success? And now that the big ERA1 deadline, which was the end of September last year, is gone, most jurisdictions are pivoting and really able to bring in these self-sufficiency services, the relocation services, and the job placement services, which of course are optional, not required, but strongly encouraged. So it's kind of like a new day right now, at least for the next 5 months, where the focus is no longer just spend before Treasury takes it back. We have a little bit of breathing room, but now the dollars are almost all gone. And most of our programming in the rental assistance space will wind down at the end of this fiscal year with the wrap up of these funds. We do have other ongoing programs at United Way. Our family stability program is case management and eviction prevention, but by and large, the overwhelming amount of work that we've been able to do will wrap up as these funds wind down.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was interested by a figure that you have on one of your slides of the cost to the social system of eviction at being $30,000 for each individual. Can you speak just a little bit more about what that entails?
Sure. So you see these figures, bandied about. Sometimes they're up to $50,000. Sometimes they're down to around $20,000. But this is where researchers are trying to get a sense of the return on investment in prevention work and trying to understand, the social cost of homelessness. For a long time, many of the nation's leaders were saying it saves money to end homelessness because it's so expensive to keep someone homeless. It's cheaper to work out a permanent supportive housing arrangement or pay their rent. And so those studies typically identify things like emergency room visits, law enforcement involvement, shelter bed stays, social service engagement, the social system like food delivery or taxiing students facing homelessness to and from their schools, their original school of origin. So there's a lot of different variables they look at. And again, that's on average. But on average, when you look at all the social costs that social services are needed for helping folks experiencing homelessness, it ends up about $30,000. That's kind of the average that I think most researchers have sort of hung their hat on recently, although you'll see studies ranging from $20,000 to $50,000. The Florida study is considered to be sort of one of the more recent and reliable ones, and that's kind of where they arrived at.
But it's pretty significant, the cost of that. And then the cost to keep, do we know what the cost is to keep people from being evicted? I mean, it seems to me that $30,000 would go a long way in preventing evictions.
Yes, I mean, our average is about $8,000 per household, and that includes forward rent, which is a great tool in the toolbox because, it takes time to process an application. You don't just want to pay off their rent debt, but you want to, make it so that they're going to have just enough time following the assistance to really get their feet underneath them, make any planned moves as necessary, or rethink their income strategy. But buying that breathing room has been really effective for us at keeping families in their homes.
Thank you for quantifying that. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to both DHCD and you guys for being here. It's a silly math question. When I look at your slide, you have the expenditures at $79 million, which corresponds to DHCD. Yet you list the income at $97 million. They have it 86.5. Can somebody tell me where the other $10 million delta is in there?
So on their slide, they had our grant award at $86 million.
Yeah, their ERAP allocation shows 86.5, and I think your slide shows 97. So I'm just trying to figure out where the $10 million is.
Right. So I think if I recall correctly, there's an asterisk on that slide that towards the top that says that was the kind of the original formula that they had come up with. There was a point at which, and the DHCD folks might be able to chime into this, but there was a point at which they had held some funds in reserve to deploy depending on strategic opportunities or spend down rates. And so about halfway through calendar year 2022, we were awarded additional funds because we were effective at getting the money out the door quickly and prioritizing kind of hotspots where need was. So there was a supplemental allocation in the middle of 2022 following the original formula.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to broaden the conversation a little bit philosophically. Obviously, preventing homelessness and preventing evictions are good public policy objectives for us. But, you know, I love the work you're doing, and I agree we need to put more money into rental assistance, broadly speaking. However, you know, my feeling on this matter has been for a very long time that the problem is supply and demand problem in the marketplace. There's a book that I have to get, and I'm going to read it. The title of the book is, quote, "Homelessness is a Housing Problem," and I'm reading from an article here in the Atlantic magazine. The University of Washington professor Greg Colburn and the data scientist Clayton Page Aldern demonstrate that, quote, "The homelessness crisis in coastal cities," and by that I take that to mean both East and West Coast, cannot be explained by disproportionate levels of drug use, mental illness, or even poverty. Rather, the most relevant factors in the homeless crisis are rent prices and vacancy rates. And the implication there is that there just isn't enough housing stock for people who are of low and moderate income. Would you agree with that, broadly speaking?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because this was a subject of my dissertation, and it's an area of expertise of mine.
For the record, I didn't know that when I fed that question to him.
So the general academic consensus on homelessness is that it's a confluence of two perspectives. So there's individual perspectives and system perspectives. And so the kind of hybrid consensus in academia is this life shocks model, where it's the system that creates vulnerabilities that render people very close to the brink of homelessness, at which point a life shock or a disruption of some kind of job loss, a medical problem, tips them over. And so you'll see researchers say homelessness is a mental health problem or homelessness is a housing problem. Both are true. So it's the supply and demand problem in the housing space that means that households can't sustain the rent, that their budgets are constrained, they're extremely housing cost burdened, and they're struggling and vulnerable. It's low U.S. savings rates that mean that there are few assets if a household experiences a shock that they can tap in order to avoid eviction. But it is still also those kind of life shocks that really are kind of the tipping point. And that's why a safety net for renters is so important. I mean, everybody has some kind of thing. I had a car catch on fire in November and had to explain to my son, how lucky we are, that we have insurance and that and that we have a safety net and we have savings. But other people don't necessarily have that, right? And so
was that car an internal combustion engine car?
So you were right. I did not think through the fertilizer analogy, and I sense that I'm walking into a trap there. But all this is to say there are little accidents and incidents that we all struggle with, and it doesn't. And for extremely poor and low-income households, it doesn't take much. And so, yes, the safety net for renters, because there's so many causes and variables, you need a big toolbox to effectively create policy that can prevent homelessness and evictions. And so, a safety net for renters is one of those tools that's a crucial piece of the equation.
Yeah, no, I'm a liberal Democrat, so I don't want to be negligent when it comes to fighting poverty, obviously. But I mean, this article goes on to say, Colburn and Aldern note that some urban areas with very high rates of poverty, I'm not saying that like it's a positive thing, areas with high rates of poverty, Detroit, Miami-Dade County, Philadelphia, have among the lowest homeless rates in the country, and some places with relatively low poverty rates, Santa Clara County, San Francisco, Boston, have relatively high rates of homelessness. And it's a pattern that is seen throughout the United States of America, where it's the lack of housing stock these are all important variables, but the lack of housing, in my mind at least, looking at it in a systemic way, is the key variable. And in my experience in Montgomery County, and I don't know how you observe this in your counties, local community groups are very, very, very good at stopping apartment buildings, especially in their school clusters. And to me, that is a challenge that we are going to have to take on in this committee. I don't know if the state government is designed to do that, but it's something we're going to look into. I'm going to recognize Delegate Stewart.
Mr. Chair, after your beautiful soliloquy here, I needed a second bite of the apple. So to put a finer point on the chairman's point, parent's point, I remember reading in the context of ERAP and other states getting it out the door. I remember reading that basically there was a correlation in how quickly and how effective and how far the ERAP dollars went in states where you did not have as much housing scarcity. Are you aware of I think I remember reading either some sort of study or some math on this, but are you aware of that phenomenon that I'm talking about? And if so, could you expound on it?
Sure. I mean, yes, you could work on the supply side, and then I think, rental assistance is almost kind of on the demand side, right? So it's a range of interventions together.
Right.
One of the points I was making is that if you don't have both strategies simultaneously, you could have, a large number of folks entering homelessness, and that will outpace the creation of new housing, at least for the next, fiscal year. So, I absolutely agree that we need more housing and that's a piece of the puzzle. And this is a very relevant point, also research was done as to what jurisdictions were the best able to mobilize quickly in a time to provide rental assistance in a time of financial crisis when the pandemic happened. And the key variable was whether or not those jurisdictions had existing infrastructure for distributing emergency rental assistance. If we don't come up with a Maryland Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we will not have standing infrastructure to activate next time there's a national crisis or a global recession. And so part of the appeal here is that we need to sustain the infrastructure that we have so that the next time there's a global recession or another variant of the pandemic or some kind of major disaster that we can activate quickly. And that was one of the key drivers of whether jurisdictions were effective at keeping families in their homes.
Great, thanks.
All righty then. Thank you very much for your presentation. What was your dissertation about?
It was called Closer to Home, and it was about media representations of homelessness during the Great Recession and housing crisis from about a decade ago, where also there was a large influx of federal funds to keep families in their homes and the lessons learned from that.
All right, very interesting. Oh yeah, actually, well, Vice Chairman has a quick question. Hold on one second. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up your last point, sustaining the infrastructure so that we're prepared for the next pandemic or pandemic-related event that's a shock to the housing system. How do you keep that infrastructure in place? Let's assume that there isn't additional rental funding that's provided to groups like United or through groups like United Way. How do you sustain that infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, so definitely funding is part of the equation, and I think the folks from DHCD had mentioned that the financial assistance giveaway is just kind of part of the equation of rental assistance, and that was very necessary at certain points in the pandemic. But that ongoing staffing support for the case management, the self-sufficiency engagement, and by infrastructure, I mean things like grant contract arrangements that by themselves added, months of time to the entire rollout of our program. Having ongoing funding arrangements maintains the grant infrastructure that you can just easily put more funds through, maintaining staff, maintaining relationships with landlords, maintaining the digital. So we contracted with Neighborly, Baltimore County uses Yardi. These are digital platforms, maintaining the licensing for those platforms so that you have the portals ready to activate if necessary. And as I sort of was hinting at, whether you go for the giant price tag that some are calling for, which is $175 million is needed for the state, or a much more modest sum, jurisdictions will be able to budget those funds and triage and target the most vulnerable, but some allocation is going to be necessary so jurisdictions can maintain their infrastructure, some of their staffing, their relationships, and their platforms and contracting. There's a whole, and like things like application documents and PDF documents. I mean, there's a whole network of institutional infrastructure. So some amount of ongoing funding is needed to maintain that. If all the funding goes away, to zero, if it goes down to zero, those relationships get lost, those platforms get retired, that information gets lost, that institutional knowledge, goes away at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. The Vice Chair was in my head as I was thinking about the same thing about infrastructure, and this is whether or not you've talked to the, department behind you, but as well as the administration about that, because one thing I think about when I think about homelessness is also migration, right? Sometimes if you're in Baltimore City, the best place for you may not be to live in Baltimore City. You may have somewhere better in Cecil County. And the ability for instance, Baltimore City, be able to move somebody to Cecil County, maybe I have a relative there or whatever is the case, the ability for the city maybe to do that versus maybe the state to be able to manage that as two different management kind of systems. So I'm wondering about, is this a conversation that has been talked to not only to the department, but to the administration? Because I feel like this conversation, we had this last year a little bit about creating an infrastructure for this type of work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think what the pandemic has proven is that having sort of our experience in the pandemic has been that having the state sort of statewide floors or ceilings of certain practices and standards, and still allowing for local customization is really kind of the match made in heaven. And then the state is able to sort of quarterback in a lot of respects for federal funds or partnerships. And so the having both sides at the table is tremendous. You know, Danielle from DHCD didn't say this, but they did a tremendous job of making sure the state was on track to meet those Treasury deadlines to avoid a clawback or a reallocation. That was DHCD's leadership that kept those monies in the state, and they deserve, you know, our tremendous gratitude. And so it's really, it's not one or the other. It's having both organizations like MACO and the local jurisdictions coming up with plans, and that really avoids the sort of thing where you have one jurisdiction that's invested a lot of money in it, and then people want to go there in search of those services. Having a statewide solution really prevents folks from, you know, trying to just migrate to where the resources are. It ensures people can stay in place and get the help they need.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, yes, it's both, but I guess I'm going back to, has that conversation been had, or is there a conversations being had to do such a thing?
So I think I have yet to participate in a conversation where we say, $0 are coming in, what on earth are we going to do? I think we all hold high hopes out for this legislative session that we can convince folks in this room and your counterparts in the Maryland General Assembly and Senate that we need some money for this effort because it's really important and families need it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very, very much. We're going to round this discussion out with our friends from MACO and MML. So let me call up Dominic Butchko and Angelica Bailey-Tupari to join us.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chair, you got my new last name correct.
Yes, would you like to go first?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You good? All right, fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Angelica Bailey-Thupari. I'm the Legislative Director for the Maryland Municipal League. I'm joined here by Dominic Butchko from the Maryland Association of Counties. We very much appreciate the invitation and your time this afternoon. We will take a bit of a broader approach at this point. Mr. Chair, you mentioned supply and demand, and that is very much contributing to our current housing crisis. So we are going to speak to you briefly this afternoon, primarily on how local governments are part of the overall housing ecosystem here in Maryland. And housing is complicated. I think we've got a sense of that from our previous presenters. So this is a high-level overview. This is not intended to be a full look at the housing landscape, but we look forward to any questions and a robust discussion. So we'll start with where local governments fit in.
Yeah, so local governments, counties, and municipalities are the closest level of government to the people, and no other version of government is impacted more by the housing crisis. This is very literally in our communities, and the decisions we make impacts our members significantly. So first, where do counties fit into all this? So counties have three major roles. The first one comes to land use, and so we're balancing planning versus preservation. So do we want agricultural and nature preserves, or do we want high and low density development? Where do we want that development? And much of that is decided at the local level. The second major thing that counties do is infrastructure and operations. So not only do we want to have housing, but we want to get people from A to B in order to have a functional economy. And so much of that transportation infrastructure is operated at the county level, as well as other public services in that domain. And then finally, counties play a major role in developing and implementing certain programmatic areas. So incentives to encourage that growth that we just talked about, housing assistance and eviction prevention. The past two presenters, the major conversation they had, all of that rental assistance passed mostly through counties and nonprofits. And then finally, social programs that counties implement as well. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. But should the housing crisis turn into a homeless crisis, that now turns into a social crisis. And much of that response is going to be had at the county level.
So there is some overlap there with counties and municipal impact on housing. For example, planning and zoning. We do have a lot of municipal authority over those processes, which is very important. But our municipal members often don't have the resources to have their own housing departments. So we're not able to provide the same social programs that Dom was mentioning and that our previous panelists were discussing. But municipalities often end up acting as a middleman or a sort of facilitator in land development. We may own the land. We may be in the process of selling it to a developer. Maybe that developer has made certain commitments about the type of housing that they plan on constructing, but they don't want raw land. They want some infrastructure already put into place. And so that's a major expense for municipalities. And in that way, we find ourselves very much in the middle of that transaction.
All right, so housing policy, whether we're talking about rental assistance or something else, there are three major policy objectives for no matter what it is broadly. First, we want to keep people in their homes. We want to prevent homelessness because the moment someone becomes homeless, the cost and the social impact is incredible. Second, we want to encourage development of new affordable housing stock. We just had a conversation briefly about the supply and demand issues. If we're not growing, if our economy and societies aren't growing, then we're dying. So we want to encourage more development. And then third, and this is one that really is lost in the conversation, we want to preserve existing affordable housing stock. Not everything can be new development. That's not environmentally or economically sustainable. So we want to preserve what we have. So in housing policy, we want to touch on all three, on potentially one, hopefully all three of these. And so moving on, local government successes. So what are your counties, your partners in government, and your municipalities doing in this sphere? So 4 major examples here. First, Prince George's County has a very unique right of refusal program. And so this is a program where, let's say you have a building with multiple units and you want to sell that building. The county actually comes in and partners with a nonprofit and has the first right of refusal. And so through that program, they can preserve affordable units. They don't mess with the free market, so you're still able to sell that building at whatever price you can get to it. Through that program, within the past 18 months, they were actually able to preserve over 1,200 units. Queen Anne's County has a unique moderately priced dwelling units program. I know Montgomery and a few others have as well. But this program, so Queen Anne's County has certain standards for affordable housing. If you are unable to meet those standards, you pay a fee to the county, and then that county uses that fee to fund other housing and social programs. Baltimore County, I want to say, last week now unveiled a ton of historic actions on housing. I can say with good authority, Baltimore County will be delivering more actions on housing, and I think for 2023, we could safely say for Baltimore County, this will be the year of housing. And then Anne Arundel County, the county that we're sitting in right now, has seen the biggest production and preservation of affordable housing in their history. If you look at the numbers right there on the slides, between 2015 and 2022, they preserved 362 units. Between 2020 and 2025, they're on track to preserve or build 1,371 units. So counties are at the forefront of this. They are putting all of their resources towards it, and right now you can see we have success.
And I do want to, as I said earlier, municipalities don't have the same resources that counties do in this area, but we have seen some successes. The city of Salisbury, for example, recently implemented the Here is Home initiative. Really fantastic. It waived some city-mandated development fees and taxes for residential development if those developers paid a small flat fee focused on subsidized housing and adhere to certain timeframe requirements. It also included some funding for homelessness programs, and this program created almost 9,000 new units in a very short period of time. And those units were for a variety of price points. Now, it did result in a bit of a hit to the bottom line of the city, but they were able to mitigate that with the minimum payment that the developers made in lieu of taxes.
All right, so moving on, for ladies and gentlemen of the committee, this is the slide that you need to pay attention for. So if there's anything you guys need to take away, it is going to be the 3 major points that we're about to cover. So first, fixable. You want solutions. There is a housing crisis. So what can we fix today? And I'm just going to point out to Delegate Stewart and Delegate Long, if you are listening right now, I know both of you are interested in housing. This is the big part. So first, more tools for local governments. And so a few things here. The land banking statute. It was passed, I believe, in 2017. Not one not one jurisdiction has so far opted to implement a land bank. And so there's a lot we can do there. Jurisdictions are interested, but as the law currently stands, it's not flexible enough. 2, incentives for further development and the creation of affordable housing and preservation. So more programs, more resources for that. The last slide, I showed you everything the counties are doing, but the counties only have so many resources and so many tools. 3rd, direct assistance. So rental assistance, housing repairs, transitional housings, direct assistance to people that we can do today will make a major difference. Also infrastructure. So water and sanitation. Queen Anne's County, I think it's Queen
They're at the
Anne.
maximum.
What?
The maximum limit.
Yeah, the maximum limit. So Queen Anne's County and a few other jurisdictions are at their maximum limit right now for wastewater treatment. So in Queen Anne's County, you cannot put up another house because they are just maxed out on what they can clean and what they can put into the Chesapeake. So investing in infrastructure so that we have everything around the housing to support everyone is super important. Same thing with power and electrification as we move to a post-fossil fuel world, schools and hospitals, and public transportation. Do you want to?
Yeah, and so much of that, especially for municipalities, has to do with flexibility. The more we incentivize, fantastic, but we need to be partners in that conversation. MML represents all 157 towns and cities in the state. I know you heard me say that last week. You're going to hear me say it probably once a day for the next, 77 days. We are just too diverse for mandates. Our members are all over the place in every possible way. So we need that flexibility. ADUs, for example, I don't think you're going to hear a municipality say that they're against the concept, but sometimes it's unworkable. So we really need that flexibility and to be at the table when we have those conversations. And then, as Dom was saying, financially, I think, many of us may have seen the article in the Capital Gazette earlier this week that the city of Annapolis itself is, I don't know if they're using the word moratorium, but stopping all new and soon-to-be construction, that's residential and commercial, for a lack of adequate public facilities. And the facility that they stated was police officers. We don't have enough cops in the city of Annapolis to protect the citizens that we already have, so we can't continue to build. And police retention is a major issue, and more money could help with that as well.
So moving on to so that first bucket is if you did something today, you will have an impact today. The second bucket is major trade-offs. And so this, as policy deciders at the state level, and then as our members, policy deciders at the local level, there's going to be trade-offs to what we decide to do here. So first, state and local building regulations. What do we want to see? Do we want to remove, for example, fire suppression systems? There are fire suppression requirements at the state level that by some estimates, before you put a shovel in the ground, cost upwards of $50,000 additional to a housing, to one unit. Building codes, adequate public facilities. I mean, we just had the conversation with Anna Rundle. For schools, how many students do we want in a classroom and what do we want to say is acceptable? How much will that impact our children? For police, how safe do we want our streets? And building energy performance standards as we move to a more efficient and more environmentally friendly community. How much of those requirements do we want to put on our houses, because that's going to add some expense at the beginning. And that's the major trade-offs. And then reality is with no easy solution, but they are things impacting housing that we have to be aware of. So broader economic forces, local economies and real estate markets, the labor markets, the supply chain, cost of materials, interest rates, all of this does not have a solution at the state and local level, yet it is something that we need to contend with, as well as environmental factors, climate change. So if we are going to build these houses, where are we going to put them? Because do we want to put them in areas that are going to be flooded potentially in X amount of decades? And what is that going to look like? Development versus preservation. So Howard County, for example, is almost entirely built out because most of their land is either developed already or it's set aside for preservation. And again, limited quantity of land. Maryland is only so big, so what are we going to do? And that also fits into trade-offs. So.
And before we move on, Dom, if you don't mind, I would like to touch briefly on property taxes. This relates very much to the supply and demand issue as well. In theory, a property cut or a property tax cut for encouraging a home buyer, especially someone who is middle or low income, is a fantastic idea. But local governments, especially municipalities, are very limited in the ways in which we can generate revenue. A big chunk of municipal income and revenue comes from property taxes. So then your local government ends up taking the hit. If we take the hit financially, we can't build out the infrastructure. future, and then that person doesn't even have a new build that they can buy. And we're not seeing the turnover in existing homes either. So it's very complicated.
And so just a closing thought, and the committee is clearly very aware of this because the first two presenters spoke about rental assistance, but we have a major crisis that will happen in the next few months without some action. And so this crisis will turn potentially from a housing crisis to a social crisis. And the two bodies that are going to be here to respond to that are going to be counties and nonprofits. And if we don't do something soon to help people who are on rental assistance right now, it will be big. And it is coming. So I think the other panelists covered that pretty well, so that's all I'm going to say there. And I think that wraps up our presentation.
Thank you very much. First question goes to delegates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I promise I won't be so chatty in our other briefings. So first of all, thank you for the continued shout outs. You clearly know the direct way to my heart is just by continuing to give me shout outs during the briefing, so I appreciate that. Secondly, I really just appreciate this presentation and y'all's thoughtfulness. This is really great, and thank you for sort of calling out the moral urgency of the crisis we're facing. I did want to address the sort of elephant in the room that you brought up briefly, which is sort of the idea of preemption or mandates. And I wanted to get your thoughts on something that sort of pairs two ideas that you discussed today and also the last time you were before the committee last week, which is the idea in the marijuana context that y'all brought up was an idea of an opt-out. And I think that other states have been kicking around this idea too. And so I wanted to get y'all's thoughts, mostly just because my schedule is so packed. And so I would have otherwise just asked you to come in for a meeting in my office, but since we're all here, might as well. What do y'all think about a preemption bill, theoretically, a mandate bill to local governments? Or for municipalities that include on housing or zoning that includes an opt-out for both cities and counties that they could exercise within a year or two of a state legislature passing. Sorry to put you guys on the spot, but
Sorry to put you on the spot about a preemption bill. No pressure, right? So can you give us, so what, you want to preempt all local planning and zoning, or what are we preempting exactly?
No. Like, let's take just like one discrete issue, like hypothetically, right? Like whether it's a parking minimum issue or like an ADU issue or like a missing middle housing issue or any of this stuff, right? If there was a statewide preemption bill, but it sort of like was the default, but counties and cities could opt out, is that something that y'all would be not necessarily interested in, but sort of amenable to having that discussion about?
I think we're certainly open to having the conversation. I'm curious just intellectually, a mandate that has exemptions, I almost kind of wonder why not just make it enabling. And also whatever that opt-out process is, if it's unduly burdensome, expensive, especially for our smaller towns that don't have many staff, then that's probably a concern that we would have, but we're always open to the conversation.
Sure, okay, I appreciate it, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that was an excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. On your first or second slide where you showed tools that local jurisdictions had adopted, the one on right of first refusal was actually the law I got passed probably 10 years ago in Prince George's. So thank you for that. But I wanted to point out, I think the statistic that followed or that was part of that said in the last, I think it was 12 or 18 months, that something like 1,000 units had been preserved. The lesson learned was the gap in between when I got that law passed and finally preserving units was because it's a great law, but then there was no money to preserve those units. How often generally do you see that kind of thing where there's a good law and a gap because there's no funding assigned to it? We actually had an affordable housing trust fund at the time that had been established in the county, but there was not one penny in it back then. Obviously, the council and the county executive since then have funded it. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so first, thank you for pointing that out. And so that is a big piece of the right of first refusal legislation, that there are financial mechanisms that the county has stood up and that make the program successful. And it's like peanut butter and jelly, they go better together. But how many times do we see, especially in housing, where there's great laws and there's not enough resources to implement them? All the time. That is why on that first slide, there is that list of that menu of things that we can do to solve today. On the infrastructure alone, there are plenty of places where they don't have enough sewer, they don't have enough schools, and we want to build houses, but we just don't have the resources to do everything we need.
Great, thank you. And then sort of a related question, I forget which legislation it was, but you talked about a bill that got, I think, a cheer from Delegate Holmes, enabling legislation.
Oh, the land bank.
Okay, passed quite a while back. Does MACO try to remind, or can you remind folks when you have a tool like that, a piece of enabling legislation that then none of your members have even taken up?
So all of our members actually brought that concern to me. They're all aware of the land banking statute. They just find it to be too restrictive. So, I mean, and we do remind them of that stuff, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and thank you for your presentation. Can you just talk a little bit what you mean by preserve affordable housing?
Yeah, so you have a situation where you go, I'm forgetting the term, when you buy it and then like flip it and then it.
I mean, flipping.
Gentrification, gentrification, there we go, it worked. Oh my God, 77 more days, guys. All right. So you see in a lot of communities where you have gentrification or things where people are getting pushed out. And so for Prince George's is a perfect example where, let's say you have a building with several affordable units and you want to sell it. The way the preservation works there is you have a nonprofit come in, they sign an agreement with the county that they will preserve X amount of units at an affordable rate for X amount of years. And so those units, even though you may do more to make them more habitable or upgrade them, they're going to stay at that affordable rent rate. And so, you know, as our economies expand, as our societies expand, we're seeing a lot of gentrification going on, but there also has to be a focus on that preservation, because you can have like DC, for example, you can have a ton of units that are super expensive in a great place, but you don't have a lot of people who live in them necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just quickly, something that you didn't mention, it might be because it no longer applies, but a lot of affordable housing was built decades ago based on federal tax credits that were available for that purpose. And apartment buildings were built that way, and they were they were low income, or they had some kind of mix of income. Are those programs completely gone now?
I don't think they're completely gone, at least from the municipal perspective, though, because we don't have very many distinct housing departments. We don't get a lot of federal funds channeled directly to municipalities. With the exception of ARPA, most of our, to the extent we receive any, housing funding does come directly from the county or the state.
I mean, it helped a lot with some redevelopment areas where, you know, you could get something new built and have people a place to live. So what is the count? Are those not available in the counties anymore?
I'm not sure. I know like some of our infrastructure money from COVID is going towards developing new projects. I'm not sure what else is available federally. I can definitely follow up on that.
Yeah, I think we want to keep access to every possible stream of revenue to make this happen, because it's a big lift for us. We don't have enough housing, and we don't have enough housing for moderate and middle and even low income people. So, and we have very little rental.
Any other questions for our friends from MACO and MML? Okay, thank you very much. That is the beginning of a very important conversation that we're going to have as a committee and as a state. So before we adjourn, I just want to make some announcements. First of all, I want to introduce to you, stand up, Quinn Johnson. He is our hybrid hearing hero. He is going to be running the systems here, and we're really happy to have you here. And then finally, Trish asked me to remind you all to stay here if you want the floor system training. So please stay put if you want that. Are there any announcements from any of my subcommittee chairs or from Jay Jacobs? If not, from anyone, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My daughter has been baking again, so members and staff, please avail yourself of her cookies. They're in the kitchen. Thanks.
All right. That's the kind of committee activity that I really appreciate. Yes, go ahead and push your, there we go. Delegate Ciliberti.
Thank you, sir, and I will footnote that they're excellent.
Okay, there we go. And yet a little bit of bipartisanship thrown in as well. So, okay, with that, we are adjourned.